So welcome to our fourth and final event of this COP event, and the topic for this final event is transport. And I think for those people who sat through the four conversations today, I think we've all experienced that they're very interconnected, and transport has come up as a topic in many. So really looking forward to this session. If this is the first session that you're joining us for today, just a heads up about what the session will look like. We have a panel at the front who I'm going to get to introduce themselves in a moment, and they're going to be listening to some input and some conversation from two absolutely brilliant speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. Then that panel will have the opportunity to ask some questions of those speakers. If there's space, we'll open it up to the rest of the room as well. And then we're going to ask the panel to vote on recommendations that our speakers come up with as to whether they're red, amber or green. And green means let's go ahead and create some action in Orkney. So in a moment, I'd like the panel to introduce themselves in one sentence each, please.
Hello, I'm Alexander. I'm a farmer from South Ronaldsay, and I kind of enjoy the technical side and more complicated sort of bits of farming and whatnot.
I'm Aisling. I was born and raised on Hoy, and I've been working in and around community development and climate for the last 3 years in Orkney.
Hello, I'm Finn McLeod. I run a software development team that is based mostly in Orkney.
Hi, I'm Adele Lidderdale. I'm an islander. I've been working in renewable energy here for about 10 years, but I'm also interested in policy.
Thank you. And our two speakers today are Howie, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, and Professor Aseem Kinra. Howie doesn't need much of an introduction to this group, but in the context of today's session, I'm introducing him as a former chair of Orkney Ferries and as somebody who's involved in the inception and arrival of the Northern Isles Ro-Ro service, and in the context that he's here today also as the director of the Science Festival. And alongside Howie, we have the pleasure of Professor Aseem Kinra. And Professor Aseem serves as the Professor of Systems Transition Engineering at Heriot-Watt University here in Scotland, but also as a research professor at the Institute of Shipping Economics and Logistics in Germany. By background, he's a social scientist and business economist, and he is involved in interdisciplinary research which spans global supply chains with a focus on value, on barriers, on complexity, on sustainability and resilience in cross-border value chains, especially in the way that they relate to logistics and transportation systems. His previous appointments have included the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark and the University of Bremen in Germany, where he founded the chair of the Global Supply Chain Management, whilst being consistently ranked amongst the top 5 scholars within his field in logistics. Finally, he has a personal life which spans multiple countries, multiple nationalities, and multiple cultures. And he's a global citizen who relates greatly to the relationships, the connections, and the networks, all of which constitute the worldwide supply chain that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And I should emphasise that I'm a non-specialist in transport, and that's because there are many specialists in specific aspects in ship design, in terminal construction, and much else. And this presentation is about standing back from the technical details and taking an overview and looking at what we want from a transport network. It's a bit like building a house. There are expert masons and electricians and plumbers to build it, but first comes the architect's design. It can happen with transport systems that early choices can be shaped to fit an older mould without us realising it. There is the story of how the rail pioneer George Stephenson set the width of his railway track. He had worked in the coal mines, so he used the width of the wagonways underground. And that width, in turn, is said to have come from the size of a cart horse that pulled them. So the past can sometimes unconsciously shape the present. On the other hand, you also get transport pioneers that have energy and vision to make a breakthrough. And that's what happened with the start of Ro-Ro in Orkney. It was the Flas family in Wyre who had been running for generations the passenger boat service, and they had the determination and the foresight to go ahead and commission a vessel, and they built landing ramps as well. Now, that stimulated the council-owned shipping company to develop Ro-Ro services for Hoy, for Flotta, and for Shappensea. For the North Isles, the push came from the farmers for shipping cattle. Cattle shipping had traditionally involved much handling and transfers. Now you can imagine loading the cattle on at the farm, driving them to the pier, having them hoisted aboard in cattle boxes, lowered into the hold, lifted out at the other end. A Ro-Ro system could cut across all that. It enabled an island haulier to load the cattle on board on the farm and drive them all the way to the mart. But when they decided on the North Isles Ro-Ro system, they set the number of ships at 2. And the reason they set the number of ships at 2 was there'd always been 2. There'd been the 2 steamers, the Earl Thorfinn and the Earl Sigurd, and then there was the Orcadia and the Islander. So 2 Ro-Ro replacement ships were ordered, which you can see today. Of course, there was the new Thorfinn and the new Sigurd. But if an island haulier drives cattle into the mart, they need to come back the same day. And it's the same with any other lorry driver going out to the Isles or coming back again. So that means you've got to put together a timetable enabling several islands to get daily return ships, return trips. And with only 2 ships, it's impossible. Let's look at the routes. There's a look at the routes there. You can actually start to see the distances that they're going to have to go. And 2 ships just couldn't do it. One vital foresight that they put into that service was to have shorter routes to Westerly and Sandy. So traditionally they had somewhere, I think I can, maybe not. Somewhere they'd had to look up there. If you look at Westerly, for instance, you can see Pirowell, where the ships, the steamers, used to go in. Well, today's terminal at Rapness is obviously much better because it cuts out a long sail around Westray. Now, similarly at Sandy, you can see Kettletoft Pier, and by putting the terminal at Loth, there's a drive through the island, but obviously, in terms of sailing time, it's shorter. And so those 2 islands of Westray and Sandy had these new terminals. Stronsay could also see the need, and you can see in Stronsay you've got Whitehall Pier there, and if you had on the west side of Stronsay a new terminal, you would save a considerable time steaming. But by the time that Stronsay asked, the Islands Council of the time felt it was too late. And so the longer distance has remained to this day. The ships were completed in 1990. They had cranes aboard for lifting on and lifting off at North Ronaldsay and in Pappy. And the cranes, they made good use of them for conventional operation while the terminals were being constructed. Now, one problem, given that they're going over to roll on, roll off, and so everything has to come on and off on wheels, one problem was the lack of a haulier in Edy. However, the Stronsay haulier was willing to assist. Now, that meant that Stronsay and Edy could be fitted together into one sailing. But then there was a need for a sailing for Westerly and a return trip, a need for a sailing for Sandy and a return trip. So there was really 3 routes and only 2 ships. The shipping companies set up a working group, but try as they might, they could not get past this. And the day came when one of the working groups said, "We need a 3rd ship." At this point, the Director of Harbours, Captain Bob Slater, said, "You've got one." And this was the time when the Islands Council had supported a company developing a short sea route across the Pentland Firth. The company went down, leaving the council with the opportunity to take over the ship that the company had bought for the route, and this was the Varagon. The council had spent £7 million on the project, but they got the Varagon as the vital missing piece in the North Isles Ro-Ro jigsaw. Now, it's fair to say, if the Varagon hadn't been there, the situation would have been very difficult. It simply was not possible to create a timetable for the return trips back and forth, the daily return trips back and forth to the island that was needed to enable a haulier service to develop. With a timetable in place, the shipping company could now approach the unions to ask for a new pattern of working practices. The unions were in an ideal negotiating position, but the unions also recognized that the new service needed their support, and they came to an agreement that both sides could respect as fair. But two further problems were sadly not solved. Ro-Ro, with everything on wheels, ended the traditional way in which Kirkwall suppliers had put goods down to the pier for island shops. Using a haulier was more complicated. Some larger shops decided to absorb the cost of driving in their own van to make their own collection. The smaller shops lost out, and some simply closed. And looking back, it is really vexing to see what happened. A second problem was that by separating out the islands into 3 different routes, the old pattern of inter-island trade was lost. Now, if you look at Edy, for instance, which is in a central position, you can see Edy there, but with Westry and Sandy to the north of it, Stronsay to the southeast. Suppose in Edy you wanted to buy bread from Westry. Now, that would be absolutely ideal. Edy doesn't have a bakery. Westry does. Super if you could get a connection, because there's, 170 or more people. You expand the market for the Westry bakery, and you add to the general overall amenity of Edy. But in order to take bread from Westry to Edy, you have to get the Westry haulier to take the bread into Kirkwall. The Westry haulier has then got to transfer to the Stronsay haulier. The Stronsay haulier sets off, drives ashore, drives onto the pier at Edy. There's a scramble to unload, drives back on board again. So you can see the complications. And of course, it's simpler and quicker for anybody in Edy who wants to buy bread to have it sent from the shop in Kirkwall, or for people when they're driving into Kirkwall to simply stock up at the supermarkets. So that loss of inter-island trade actually was like a straitjacket on the new Ro-Ro service, because it meant that you could not get the benefits of you could not get the economic benefits that normally can result by transport, which takes 2 separate markets and links them into one bigger market. So the North Isles, despite all the investment in the system actually damped down inter-island economic activity and fragmented the North Isles into a series of smaller satellite markets for Kirkwall. Now, neither of these consequences was, of course, intended, but they came about because the planning started with the ships, and then that constrained everything else. The Varagon saved the situation, but the lesson is clear. When planning a transport network, you should start with the overall aims and then move to the means of achieving them. If you start with the timetable and then work out which ships and which routes are needed, you can then get what you want. And it's like a house. When you're building a house, you don't start by ordering a lot of doors and windows and then asking an architect to come up with a design that can somehow fit them all together. In other words, transport has to be seen as a whole, as a system. And that's one of the skills of Aseem, of Professor Aseem Kinra of Heriot-Watt University in Stromness. And I'm so pleased that Aseem is in Orkney and based in Orkney, and I'm so pleased that he's here today. And he's going to come and explain a bit more about this systematic thinking in the whole theory of transport. Aseem.
So good afternoon. I'm not sure if, I hope you don't have so many expectations from me, because first of all, it's late in the afternoon. And the second thing is, I am actually, yes, I am a transport specialist, but I come from the logistics point of view. But nevertheless, I'm very happy to be invited by Howie, and very happy to, given this introduction, being a novice to Orkney, on how the transport geography looks like in Orkney. This is what we call the transport geography, what Howie has just shown us in map, and how which different islands are there and how they are supposed to be connected. Before I just give a background of what I see as the problem that Howie described in this very nice description of what really happened when we started with the Ro-Ro concept here in the islands. A few facts. So a few facts like transport is basically is an essential need. Yet, if you look at it from a business organizational problem, I mean, it's really in the back end. You know, if they say, if you can make it, any dummy can ship it. Yeah, that's the one reality of transport. So transport is not supposed to be high on the agenda. It's always in the back end in decision making. Another thing is that transport provides space and time utility. Yeah, the need for transport itself arises because of two facts. Because demand cannot be fulfilled right at the place where things are manufactured, because demand is far away, then the need for transport arises. Yeah, and it is in a different time that the demand happens. That is why the need for transport arises. The case of the bread, for example, in E-Day. So these are some facts that we should consider why transport exists. Yeah. Beyond that, there's been a lot of focus on transport of recent, not least because of the emissions that transport makes. Yeah. So this is a typical graphical description about how good or how far transport now is to meeting the emission targets, the net zero targets, and we can see even with the most conservative measures, transport is not in line to meet the net zero targets by 2050. Yeah? And of course, road transport, and these are European figures, but UK figures are similar. I come from mainland Europe. Road transport is actually one of the biggest emitters of carbon emissions in blue, followed by aviation sorry, this is all road transport. These are all road transport figures, this one. But generally, road transport is one of the biggest, followed by aviation and shipping. Now, this is the reality, harsh reality, of why we are not on target to meet the net zero things. Then the next question is, how well are we doing in Orkney? Because this is going to be on everybody's minds. And although I'm new to Orkney, I have been introduced to the Island Center of Net Zero, and they've been doing some great work here of recent, trying to collect data on emissions, carbon emissions, where they're happening most. So if you go down to their website, they can actually, and you click on this figure, then you come to this nice dashboard, and here you can see, I'll just make it bigger for you, Orkney in the middle in relation to the other island groups, Shetland, and the Outer Hebrides on the left. So here you can see Orkney, the most of the carbon emissions are actually coming down from livestock. Transportation, the amount of transportation emission there, we can go down deeper into this. We can drill down a little bit and see if we can do that. So that, Anyway, we can't. Anyway, so you could see here, the main point of this is that in Orkney, most of the emissions are coming from livestock, whereas in the Shetland and the Outer Hebrides, it is coming from peat. Yeah? And that is something to do with the restoration of peat and how it is dealt with. That's more of my colleagues who explained this. This is also a new thing for me, that if you don't really actually take care of it, that if you deforest it or if you do not maintain it, this would actually lead to higher carbon emissions. Yeah? But transport is not a big thing right now here in the Orkney. Contributes not so highly as compared to the Shetland, much lesser, and that is understandable because Shetland is farther away geographically and is also made differently. No value judgment, actually, because we can't really say whether Orkney is doing well or not. These are just numbers and figures. Yeah? I just wanted to give you where Orkney's emissions are coming from. Yeah? Now, let us come back to some basic issues about transportation, the system, and why do we see what we saw, how we just described. So when we create a link between two places, let's just say one island to another island, how do we do that and why do we do that? The typical mentality of how a transportation planner typically thinks, he's a marginal utilitarian, and he or she thinks that, okay, let's measure OD, original destination, get some original destination data, let's add this up and see what is the demand for transport. If the demand for transport is highest, OD destination data shows in between these two islands, let us have some kind of a link there. Right? This is the typical mindset that is happening. So we have things like, typically we have things like, or dilemmas like, does transportation have an independent demand or a derived demand? Yeah? So transportation could have an independent demand from the perspective of a collective market, or even in some cases a monopoly, where the transportation infrastructure is laid down. The government pays a lot for that infrastructure, and that sort of generates the normal welfare in terms of pricing of the infrastructure, of the transportation prices. Or it could be a perfect competition market where there is a good, because of which the demand for that good derives the demand for transport. Right? So if there is a demand for bread in an island, because of that we would have a derived demand for transport to transport that bread to that island. Yeah? So on the one hand, we have this traditional way of looking at transport, and on the other hand, nowadays, what is being talked about is something called integrated demand, that you can't really separate these things. The value of a product the value of transportation is closely tied to the value of the product that you're transporting. That could be you as well as a person. Yeah? So you could, if you are unhappy, in the end you don't have a smiley, you don't click on the smiley thing after you come out of the transportation system, let's say the London Tube or something. Then so basically that is not just a customer unhappy product, but that is also the unhappy service, and this is closely tied together. So this is what we are seeing much more now. Another thing is, typically, a transport planner has thought about something called accessibility. Is that place accessible or not? Yeah? Whereas what we need to think about or move our thinking about is, it's not the question of just creating an access, it is creating a connection, a relationship. If there is no relationship, even though you can recreate the connection, it will not happen. So we can connect this room to a lot of South Indians in the world right now on a telephone, by the way. But that does not mean that you will start talking to them. None of you will do that. And they will not take your call, and you will not take their call. Yeah? So basically, accessibility and connectivity are two different things, and on a higher level relationship is a different thing. Yeah? The third important thing, why does a transport infrastructure come into place in the first place? Yeah? Why does a link come into place? I think everybody has heard about the cost-benefit analysis. Yeah? And I think this morning, another speaker, I think it was probably Tim Lang who said this, that we need to get our evidence right, we need to do a benefit-cost analysis. Yeah? The thing is, all fine, we should do a benefit-cost analysis. But what if the benefits and the costs are not known a priori, ex ante, and only come to be realized ex post? Take the example of Ede losing its connection with Westray. So what we do is we say, well, this is not of really importance because most of the bread is traded between Kirkwall and Westray, so we need to have a link there, and then Kirkwall to. So most of the value lies in this route because there is a demand in Kirkwall for this bread, and then on the other hand, a demand in Ede for the bread at a certain price. So we should do that. But what if this we have not understood that taking away this route is taking away a connection which could have, had there been a connection, created another kind of economic value that is not known. Yeah? It's not sure, by the way. Yeah? I know it might be his idea that we should have this link because he has a family on the other side. It's not sure. But this is something that we typically don't take into account when we do transport planning, which is something called wider economic benefits. And this term was secretly coined by somebody called Jules Dupuy, a French transport engineer, in fact, who learned economics on the side. And what he did, he showed actually the things that I'm trying to say. He actually empirically proved that point. Yeah? So he went against the Marshallian theory of consumer surplus and said, well, actually, you could also think about transport in this way and think about wider economic benefits. Finally, when we always think about optimizing a system, when in transport, we think about optimizing the system. Now, when we optimize transport, we always think about optimizing two things: cost versus responsiveness, or cost versus accessibility. Yeah? These are the things that we optimize, which means at what cost can we make Ede accessible to this passenger? At what cost can we make Westray accessible to this passenger at this speed, for example? But what we do not think about are emissions or the sustainability aspect in that. And that is something that also requires a change, a step change in the thinking. Now, given that, because this is a COP, what are the strategies that are there to do this, to think about these things? You could reduce, you could slow down, reduce, you could do everything, these words, So you could reduce your freight transport demand, you could optimize your freight transport modes, you could increase asset utilization, which means how much load you put onto a transport mode, or you could actually improve your fleet energy efficiency, or then finally, you could reduce the total carbon content of your fleet, transportation fleet, which means instead of using aviation, you could use more shipping, or you could actually use hydrogen-based solutions in the future, let us just say, right? So there are these different things. We have known about all these things. These are the different decarbonization strategies for transport. And it's a mix of things that we need to think about when we design a transport system. Yeah? So it's not only one, but we have to think about each one of them and how to deal with each one of them. Yeah? And then, of course, there are low-hanging fruits, and there are what you call is higher-hanging fruits, which need higher time to deployment, but which have a higher GHG impact overall, right? So we know these things in terms of transport now, that we could actually, in the short run, we could have some efficiency focus using, for example, improving backhauling. For example, a lot of times a truck goes into Ede to deliver something, but comes empty on the other hand. Now you could actually improve that by refilling the truck or the load with something else. Yeah? So you could do all these kind of things this is just an example of a measure, right? In the midterm, you could actually change the supply chain. So there was a nice person this afternoon asking us to thinking about local supply chains. Let's make food local, yeah? That was the person. That's what the person was talking about, right? Let's think about food locally. Forget the global supply chain. Why should the seeds be coming from a huge multinational corporation, American multinational corporation being shipped here? You know, cut down those food miles. Yeah, and in the long term, you could think about green energy. Simply think about we need to invest in green hydrogen, for instance. Yeah, it's not my favorite. It's an example. Yeah, so these are the things that we could do as think about as solutions. And this is also what we need to find in terms of a sweet spot for Orkney in the future. And with this, I think I don't have much. I hope I managed to compliment you. Yeah.
That was lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much, Aseem. Now we're going to move to Shetland because Ro-Ro developed differently in Shetland from Orkney, and that was due to one key fact of geography. We're going to get an image in a moment of Shetland, and you'll be able to see, in fact, here it comes. Here's, all right. You can actually imagine Shetland on the map. You know, Orkney is you could almost think of Orkney as a circle, couldn't you, with the islands kind of spread out. But Shetland's much more like linear. It's due to the underlying geology. It's just a different type of rock. It's a spinal structure that you've got in Shetland. And that means that transport, inter-island transport's very different. Now, in particular, there's the two most northerly islands of Yell and Unst. And there they are. John's got them in sight. Now, you can see what a difference, isn't it? The geography of Shetland. Notice how much closer the islands generally are in Shetland than in Orkney. And then if you look right up at the top, look at Yell there and see that short distance. In fact, the sea distance of the Shetland mainland to Yell's is just 20 minutes. Unst is just 10 minutes from Yell. Fettler is a bit further, but it can be served by the Unst ferry. Now, the geography forced Shetland to look on a Ro-Ro ferry as a kind of bridge. A bridge, the ferry is shuttling back and forth many times a day, shuttling back and forth so much that you're never going to have a very long delay in waiting. Now, you see the difference between the Shetland routes and the Orkney routes, and of course the west of Scotland routes. Oban to Barra, for instance, is nearly 5 hours. And then when you get these longer routes, that means the crews have to stay overnight on the ferries. That adds substantially to building costs and operating costs. So right from the start, Shetland had a head start on Ro-Ro simply because of the geography. They called it the overland route, and they put it in place early. Indeed, Shetland's county surveyor Jack Moore went to Norway and Faroe to study ferry services, and he wrote a book that's a complete design blueprint for the system. It specifies ships, capital, running costs of ferries and terminals, the timetables there, and even the fares, the whole thing like an architect's design. And he could do it just because of those very short sailing distances between the Shetland mainland and Yell, and between the north end of Yell and Unst. It succeeded so well that today those North Isles ferries in Shetland are running back and forth from around 6 in the morning till nearly midnight. And you can see that's the timetable. That's the winter timetable. That's where there's a bit less demand. You can imagine the summer timetable even more. The ferry from the Shetland mainland to Yell carries about 150,000 cars a year. That's nearly twice the total for all the islands in Orkney. And then that raises the question, doesn't it? Is there any way to put in shorter shuttle-type links for Orkney. Well, right at the start of the North Isles Ro-Ro, there were suggestions for an additional terminal on the west side of Edy, specifically for Westray. I think I can go back if I'm careful. I can go back there. You see where Edy is in that central position. This idea came, I heard it first in Sandy, and this was this suggestion, put in a terminal on the west side of Edy, specifically for Westray. Then you take the existing terminal as a kind of hub where a Kirkwall link would come into Edy, then you'd cross Edy for the Westray ship, and at the existing Edy terminal, you'd have a third ship that would shuttle between Edy, Sandy, and Stronsay. Now, if at that point you take a second new terminal and you put it on the west side of Stronsay at Stursey, which the Stronsay people all along said was the logical one, you make the distances so short. It's just 20 minutes from Edy to Sandy, and Stronsay wouldn't be much further. So you see, in terms of inter-island connectivity, you make a huge difference. And in terms of the potential of the system to expand and frequency of ships, you make a huge difference. You open up the possibilities. We mentioned the bakery, for example, Westray to Edy, Edy's secondary pupils going to the Sandy School for up to 4 years. And the 4 islands are now linked together into a bigger and more viable economic unit. And the shortness of the ferry routes gives capacity for expanding traffic between them. And that's the problem with these long routes now from Kirkwall to Westray, Sandy, Edy, or Stronsay, Edy, or Sandy. They're long routes, so you can't put extra ones in the day as you can in Shetland. With all those routes, all those services out to Yellowknust. You could go further. You could make Shapmonsey a stepping stone on the route. That would give Shapmonsey a more frequent service, and that could encourage housing expansion in Shapmonsey, because it would make it much easier to live in Shapmonsey and work in Kirkwall. And we heard in the previous presentation about the sprawl in Kirkwall and the cost, the huge cost on infrastructure. Well, an investment in an expanded Shapmonsey ferry link could then take some of the housing pressure off Kirkwall and give added scope then for living in Shapmonsey. You could go further, and we're going in a series of steps. You could then have a new Ro-Ro terminal at the north end of Shapmonsey. And there is also the potential of a tunnel to Shapmonsey. Now, fixed links have helped Bury and South Ronaldsay thrive. They've helped Trondra and Burra Isle in Shetland, linked by a bridge developed by the same Jack Moore who brought the Ro-Ro ferries. And indeed, the success of those Ro-Ro ferries in Shetland has generated so much traffic that Shetland's now looking at the potential to move on to subsea tunnels. We have on the Science Festival's YouTube channel an interview with Professor Andy Sloan, one of the leaders in the field. He talks about tunnels generally in Scotland. He also talks about the feasibility of a tunnel to Shapmonsey and then using the spoil for a fixed link, a link to link Helier home to Shapmonsey. The 2 islands that didn't get Ro-Ro for clear cost reasons, North Ronaldsay and Pappy, did get compensation through cheaper airfares. That idea was developed by the Community Council liaison officer Ronnie Tulloch, and it's worked brilliantly. North Ronaldsay passengers have a 15-minute flight to Kirkwall compared to 2 hours, 20 minutes from sea journey from Stronsay. In terms of energy and cost, it's cheaper to take passengers in a small plane than driving their car on a ferry, and planes have much greater flexibility of routes. But there's 2 problems. The first one is massive, it's freight. But for smaller freight items, there's the new Windracer system carrying up to 150 kilograms of freight in an unpiloted aircraft. It's come about through Kirkwall Airport's new role in testing more sustainable aircraft. Again, online, we'll have within a week to 10 days' time, we'll have online an interview with Lucas Prince from SATE, the Sustainable Aviation Test Environment at Kirkwall Airport, and he'll summarise the potential of the Windracer system. He'll also describe an airship development on the way, the Airlander, that can take 14 tons of cargo. And he'll describe the plans for an upgraded version of the Airlander that can take up to 80 tons of cargo. So the question is, could that be a freight solution for North Ronaldsay and Pappy? Could it even simplify air freight generally so that a building contractor might be able to deliver equipment and materials point to point from the builder's yard direct to the construction site? But of course, air travel, despite all its proven successes for Orkney's North Isles, has a cloud hanging over it, the stigma of using fossil fuel. It's blocking options that could actually save on carbon. For instance, for Inverness to Barra, there's no direct flight. You go by car or train to Glasgow Airport, car to Oban, and a long ferry journey. So aviation could make a difference. And the stigma of aviation fuel is no more. A process taken forward in Orkney produces synthetic aviation fuel from green hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Now, this provides a revolutionary opportunity, an opportunity to look afresh at aviation solutions, with wind racers for smaller freight, including, of course, island shops, with the Airlander option for heavier cargo. There is a whole range of new possibilities. And this would apply to the whole Highlands and Islands. As anyone knows, when trying to get from Aberdeen to Stornoway or Stornoway to Shetland, the whole northern transport network is so rigid. Sustainable aviation fuel has the potential for transforming Scottish transport. And so, in conclusion, here are recommendations for action. Within Orkney, open up the transport discussion, put all the options on the table for the council and the communities. In fact, that was very much the language of the previous session on housing. They were saying, don't only look at houses, look at the total vision of what kind of society, what kind of community we want in the future. And by doing so, by opening up the options, we can then gather views, encourage the community councils to join the discussion, to gather views, the Islands Council to help the debate with data, including economic and social. And we've seen, as we did in the previous discussion on housing, how important the data is. For the Scottish Government, there's something they could really do that would make a huge difference to all the rural communities in Scotland, assist the development of sustainable aviation fuel. And then also for the Scottish Government and Highlands and Islands communities, look afresh at new aviation transport options from sustainable aviation fuel from wind racers and freight airships. To conclude, there are at least 4 options, and all of those options need to be debated and explored. It might be that at the end people go for the status quo, and if so, at least they do so from an informed position. There's also Trua Ro-Ro, which could go step by step. New terminals on the west side of Edy, Stronsay, the possibility of bringing in Shappensea, and then this one of expanding air options. So, in conclusion, the recommendations then are for discussion about a lot more options than might have previously seemed to be the case. Thank you.
There is a huge amount to take in there, and I'm going to come to our panel first for questions. So one concise question, please, from each panel member.
Has any analysis been done on dynamic routing algorithms, like, for example, the kind of algorithm that Uber uses to route passengers within a city, and would that apply in any Orkney context?
I am not aware of any work that has been done in this context, but neither in the, perhaps in some of the isles in Netherlands this has been done to connect, but I'm not aware of the Orkney context that a dynamic routing, so routing options have not been explored. But good that you bring in routing, because the kind of routing that Howie was trying to show, was simple linear routing, but some kind of circular routing systems are also an option, and that would probably be a way to look at it in the future, to put some kind of a dynamic routing.
How do you weigh up the balance between like reducing carbon and increasing mobility between them? Because the way to stop people travelling and burning carbon would be to remove the ferries.
Can I come in? Me first and then Aseem. Well, first of all, I don't think carbon is a problem in the sense that I mentioned sustainable aviation fuel. You know, it's shown to be technically possible. If you get sustainable aviation fuel, then the whole carbon issue has been removed from aviation. But in addition, you save carbon then on road, because, my goodness, these road options with ro-ro ferries are just so complicated, and they burn. I gave the example, you know, if you want to travel, for instance, I actually travelled 2 years ago from Elgin to Barra, and it worked out, and I wanted to go on public transport. I thought, oh, well, I just get the train somewhere, and I actually found the only way I could do it, I had to drive down to Oban, and then this time, just a couple of months ago I did it, and I actually flew, but I couldn't fly from Inverness. They don't have a link to Barra, so I had to take the train to go down to Glasgow. And so, you know, we're burning up a lot of carbon on the roads, and because we've assumed that air basically doesn't have very much of a future. And then similarly, if it comes to ships anyway, and if it comes to surface transport, we had that first session with Neil and Gareth this morning when they were talking about the potential of using this large amount of energy that Orkney's producing, using it locally, in turning it into, it could I think they said, didn't they, e-fuel, for instance, or turning it into electric systems. So I do feel that there are solutions to the carbon issue, and that then means we should focus totally on the transport one and getting the transport one right.
Let's stick with the panel questions, and if we've got room, we'll come to the floor.
Yeah, so to an extent, we type these as lifeline services. They cost what they cost to deliver, and there's little manoeuvre on reducing that service. But you mentioned there about wider economic benefits as a measure instead of cost-benefit analysis, and I just wondered if you had a good example of a town or an island or somewhere in the world that has made good use of that measuring system.
I think this idea of wider economic benefits is, yes, in some places in Germany, I cannot give you a particular, because I would be wrong, but I can give you an example what a wider economic benefit is, and especially in this context, because perhaps a ferry is a better link than an air link, because it creates more socialization, which is needed on a remote community, and that is a wider economic benefit, and that you would actually cut down if you would try and put people in a plane, yeah? So you would actually, so that could be something like that. So quality of life, anything that increases the quality of life could be seen as a wider economic benefit. So, but there are towns, I think the methodology that they use, I'm not sure, but I can find this out for you, it's called extended cost benefit analysis. And there they use this aspect of wider economic benefits and also costs. The same with carbon accounting. I mean, the carbon accounting can be taken to, you can do that within your cost benefit analysis as well, and then figure out actually what could be a better option. But that is not the only thing for a decision maker, and especially when it comes to political decision making in the end. There are other things, especially when we are talking about remote islands and what kind of quality of life we need to provide here.
Could just to add, I was thinking one model of a development was what they called Metroland, how in the 19th century companies developed the London Underground and then the London Metro. Now, the companies made the whole thing very economic because the companies also bought land around the stations. So that meant that they could bring together the connectivity and the economic growth. You know, they would sell sufficient land that would then generate a return to fund the rail.
And this also brings to the dynamic routing model, because you said, has anybody explored this? I'm going to explore this because I'm going to look at mobility hubs in the future for the islands. And there, in that context, we are trying to look at dynamic mobility and also then coming to the modeling of those, right? So basically, anybody is a transporter because everybody is a grandmother in the future, as some of the figures showed us, that so many people will be actually on the older side. So far right is the word that they used. I don't know what did they use, but anyway. So you need to understand this, take this into the context of mobility hubs, and then also understand, okay, how can we transport, use everything else to be as a transporter, you know, in the future. Yeah.
No further questions from the panel. Who's my roving mic person? I think we've got a lady in the middle of the front row who's desperate to ask a question, so we're going to go there first, and then maybe one other concise question. So the lady in yellow.
So I'm Uta Clarkson, I'm based in Sandy, so I've got an Isles view. I've sort of been talking to people in Sandy, and the main issue people seem to have was connecting where they wanted outward connectivity. Like they say, they can't catch the plane, whatever else they do, they have to stay the night, that kind of stuff. And one thing I was wondering is, there's none of the fast ships featuring on there. These little electric Zevi thing, I don't know if it would work. I don't think anybody does, but if it did, I think Logan Air might actually go packing. It's outward connectivity, but also connectivity to the job. It's like this person who was working at the grammar school, and when they were going back to the ferry, they didn't find a car parking place and missed the ferry, and that kind of stuff. So that is the sort of having a transport chain, and you always have a transport chain.
Yes, I would just say that connectivity is the key thing, and it can be that, you know, sometimes separating passengers from freight can be very good. I mean, Aseem knows much more than I do about this, but I can see that passengers have different requirements than freight. You can take time with freight, for instance, but not with passengers. So I think any development exploring the potential of greater connectivity for passengers can be a good thing.
Hello. Right, okay. Expand air options, what does that mean for the Ro-Ro? New ships, what type of new ships? Because it's been proven that catamarans are far more economical than single monohulls. And in my opinion, I think a combination of the four options to produce a fifth option, which would incorporate sections of each option, would be possibly a better solution. Just a question.
Could you summarise the question in one sentence, the last bit of it, please?
Would a combination of the four options, just taking aspects of each four option to make a fifth option, be another possible solution? For example, new shapes with true Ro-Ros and shorter routes and expand air options.
New ships with just sorry, it's the sound system. I have difficulty sometimes picking up some of the sounds. That a fifth option of new ships with.
Right. No, basically combine the four options into into a fifth option. For example, new ships from option 1, shorter terminals, chaplaincy, and also expand air options. I would say primarily for freight, because if it's for passengers, that omits disabled people.
Yes, yeah. When I said four options, I should have said these are not mutually exclusive options. You know, it's definitely possible to combine some, and in fact, I think the question really was raised when the new ro-ro ships came in the early 1990s. Question was raised, what was the relationship between the new ro-ro service and the inter-island air service? And there was a period of uncertainty, and gradually, as time's gone on, it's clear that for passengers, air has so many advantages over it. So, yeah, certainly and I think that's the kind of discussion that should go, because you might well find that a particular community has a particular mix of options that suit it.
Just one short comment. It's a very great point, actually, to have multimodality and use all kinds of things. There's just one hindrance. The political backing for this would be very low, because any transport project starts with one, and then the concept of unintended benefits and costs comes into play, because we don't really know what will happen when we actually introduce a new terminal. There could be a projection, a forecast, but we do not know. And since this is a capital-intensive project, so that's why it has to be done in a phased way. Yeah.
No, but second thoughts, no. I think the panel.
Yet again, we're in a situation where there were more hands going up than time, so the speakers will be here at the end. In the room to answer some questions. So really conscious that people wanted to get some questions answered. I am going to come to the panel now, who are just having a little moment of conferring. And I think when that's done, Aisling is going to come forward to the mic and say, is it a red, amber or green?
Right, hopefully you can all hear me okay. Transport is clearly quite a delicate conversation, and it's tied to various themes, including economic development, resilience, population growth and retention, and island identity as well. We certainly support the recommendations suggested here today, as there's really no harm in exploring multiple new proposals and investing in solutions for the future that benefit islanders, visitors, and Orkney as a whole. Thank you.
So as we wrap up, a thank you to our panel. And a thank you to our two speakers for the amazing presentations. And for those people who want a chance to chat to them further, or they've got questions that weren't answered, the Grey Air room at the back straight after. Thank you.